So Etefano, it is now my really great pleasure to introduce someone whose leadership, intellect, integrity have shaped the educational landscape across Australasia. So Professor Barney Glover began his five-year term as Commissioner of Jobs and Skills Australia in 2024. He brings to this role not only his deep expertise as a mathematics educator and mathematician, but also a reputation as a deeply collaborative and visionary academic leader. Professor Glover served as Vice-Chancellor and President of Western Sydney University for a decade, a period marked by bold innovation, inclusive engagement, and a strong focus on building bridges where higher education, vocational education, and community meet. In 2019, he was appointed Officer of the Order of Australia for his service to tertiary education and professional associations and cultural institutions. And in 2024, Western Sydney University honoured him with the title of Emeritus Professor. Throughout his career, Professor Glover has been known not only for his strategic mind, but for his heart, consistently championing the inclusion of First Nations Australia, disadvantaged communities, and those too often left at the margins of formal education systems. His influence extends across disciplines, and today he plays a critical role in shaping workforce strategy for a nation navigating change. Join me in a very, very big welcome for Professor Barney Glover to talk to us about the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. So thank you to Conco, particularly to Catherine, for the invitation to be with you today. What I'd like to do is to give you a bit of insight into what Jobs and Skills Australia does, and I appreciate I'm amongst people with a shared appreciation for and commitment to pathways through vocational education and training and into the labour market, and more generally perhaps into further education and training in various ways, and commitment to lifelong learning. So I hope a lot of what I'm going to say resonates with you. It'll be an Australian perspective. I've got a couple of OECD perspectives I wanted to bring in towards the end just to indicate some of the discussions going on in Australia. It's a really exciting time in Australia at the moment for the way we're trying to reshape our tertiary education system, and I'm very pleased to be contributing to that in a number of ways, and we'll touch on that as we go along. Hopefully some time for questions if people have any a little later. So I don't want it to seem as if it's a little bit, what's the right word? A little bit patchy in the sense of a number of different things I want to talk about, but I did want to give you a broad view of the work of JSA, what's happening in the tertiary system in Australia, and more broadly, some of the global trends that we're trying to respond to, and I think would resonate here in New Zealand. I had an opportunity yesterday to meet with three of your ministers to talk about the New Zealand labour market, the New Zealand skills system, what we're doing in Australia, what might have some resonance here. So I appreciated those opportunities. And I want to thank Catherine and Martin for taking me to dinner last night. I appreciated that as well. It was great to catch Martin and Carol again after a number of years. Martin and I worked together in the Northern Territory for quite a while, so it was great to see Martin. Now, a little bit about JSA for those who perhaps, and I'm sure it's almost everyone in this room, don't particularly know what Jobs and Skills Australia is about. It's about 3 years of age. It was one of the first things the Albanese government did when it came to power in 2022, was to have a Jobs and Skills Summit in Australia. It was a major mandate of the Albanese election campaign of 2022, was to address jobs in Australia, to post-COVID, to begin to rebuild the Australian labour market, and in particular to ensure that the national skills system is fit for purpose in Australia, to ensure that all Australians have the opportunity to participate to their full potential in the Australian labour market and through the national skills system. It's very inclusive, to come back to the comments we just heard, a very, very inclusive approach to ensuring we have broad participation in the labour market. JSA emerged from that summit as a major initiative. So it was the first piece of legislation passed by the Albanese government, was to establish JSA. It takes over from a another organisation, another entity, the National Skills Commission, which was established by the former Liberal National Party government in Australia, with a similar remit, but JSA has a much broader one, which I think you'll see. I won't go through all of these legislative functions, but I did want to touch on a couple of them. We have a very strong focus on what's happening now and in the near and longer term in the Australian labour market. So what trends do we see? We do a lot of employment projections by industry sector. We do a lot of big studies on what's happening on key sectors of the Australian economy. And when we do that, while we're very interested in workforce planning and forecasting, our particular attention is the intersection between the labour market and the skills system. And from our perspective, the skills system, the national skills system in Australia, is made up of 4 component parts. Vocational education and training, obviously, higher education, so our university sector, and more broadly our non-university higher ed providers, skilled migration, and we have a role to play in providing advice to government on skilled migration, particularly temporary employer-sponsored skilled migration against various priorities in Australia's migration strategy. And finally, business investment in training, so the sort of less formalised, less credentialed training that goes on within business and industry. So they're the 4 component parts. Part of the role of JSA is to look at those component parts to understand the interplay between them and to see how that ensures that we have a workforce with the skills they need for the future. We're very interested in pathways between and across the tertiary system. One thing, if you pay any attention to Australian discussion around tertiary education, you'll hear us talking about a system rather than sectors. One of the things that Jason Clare, our Minister, is introducing, and the interim Australian Tertiary Education Commission is reinforcing, is that we have to move from a very competitive system to, very competitive sector of higher ed and a very controlled vet sector to a system, a tertiary education system. I want to touch on what that might look like. But we're very interested in pathways and removing inertia and barriers to movement, particularly with a lens on those from a disadvantaged background, equity groups in particular, First Nations Australians, gender barriers we're particularly interested in addressing alongside culturally and linguistically diverse people in Australia, and people with disability, and we'll do some major studies in that space as well. And we're interested in insecure work. So one thing in the Australian economy with the Labor government is a concern about insecure work and the impact it has particularly on women and First Nations Australians. So we're doing some deep analysis of that. And I'll talk a little bit about our work with big integrated data assets, because evidence-based, strong research-based policy development is critical to Australia's future, as it would be to New Zealand. Having that research capability is critically important. JSA provides that through a very substantial capability linking into the Australian Bureau of Stats and very large integrated data assets. I think you have an integrated data initiative in New Zealand, so no doubt doing very similar things. JSA is probably the biggest user of integrated data assets in the Australian government system. So that's a little bit about our remit. I report against 5 commissioners' outcomes as a way of providing my minister with a sense of what I'm going to be doing and focused on. Importantly, I have a ministerial advisory board that provides advice to me. JSA is what's called a tripartite agency in the Australian government context, which means that we have a particular focus on consultation with governments, state, territory and Commonwealth, with business and with unions. So the tripartite nature of everything we do, I believe, adds a lot of value and strength to the reports that we produce, because we have a tripartite lens on all that we do. I have a statement of expectation from my minister, and that guides me along with the advice of the Ministerial Advisory Board. And I report against these five very broad themes: fostering inclusive participation. So, as I've touched on, the diversity and inclusion agenda for JSA. We have a particular focus at the moment on our foundation skills work. We're doing a very large survey to reset, to re-baseline Australia's foundation skills, literacy, numeracy, for adults. Digital literacy we're also exploring, and we have a project, Murtu Youngerland, which is focused on our remote Indigenous communities in Australia, because a normal foundation skills survey is not relevant in that context. We need to approach that in a much more co-designed way with those remote communities to discuss literacy skills in remote Australia. And the one skill I would add to that, which is getting a lot of attention in Australia, I'm sure it will be here, is AI. And I'll talk a bit more about AI and what we're doing about that in a moment. So fostering inclusive participation, understanding today's workforce. We produce a lot of reports on what's happening in the workforce, internet vacancy, recruitment activity, a whole range of things from business surveys and from ABS data, Australian Bureau of Stats data. Shaping the future workforce, a lot of the attention on JSA is really about our big studies, and I'll touch on those in a moment just to show you the work we do. Optimising pathway and systems architecture. This is really the national skills system. The interplay between VET and higher ed, the interplay between VET and the labour market, skills matching, big issue in Australia, and from the conversations I had yesterday with your ministers, an issue of concern here. Are we matching skills coming out of our, in human capital terms, coming out of our education and training system with the needs of a developing economy and a challenging economic environment? And if we're not, how can we do that better? So we put a lot of effort into trying to understand that. So optimisation of that system. And that's where we do a lot of big data work, because we track people through person-level integrated data assets to see what happens to individuals as they transition through the vocational education and training system, and to see what value, what benefit a VET qualification can bring. I'll say more about that in a moment. And finally, activating an informed dialogue. This is a very distinct requirement. We have to talk to people. We want to, of course, but we have to as well by mandate. So we have a very active consultation program on all of the work that we do. So they're my Commissioner's outcomes. They're going to be modified a little bit for the next phase of work, because not surprisingly, we are going to pivot towards productivity as a particular focus for JSA in our work. Participation and inclusive participation remains a major theme, and the skills system. So there'll be a slightly simpler version of that. I'm not going to go through this in any great detail. This is a slightly more detailed version of what we do, so the slide pack is available if anyone would like to drill down on it. But I wanted to focus on three things on this slide just to give you a sense of what we do. We have a particular focus on regional Australia. Now, in the Australian context, geographically, that's complex. 99% of Australia is regional, so outside of the big capital cities, the Brisbane, Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast area, Sydney, obviously Melbourne, to a lesser extent Adelaide, Perth. The rest of Australia is really regional, and so looking at those at a particular regional economic zone level, we provide a lot of detailed analysis, and we've just produced a regional roadmap for Australia for jobs and skills, with a particular very comprehensive data product called Atlas, which enables people to compare regions through a range of data indicators that we can pull together. And we're going through consultation at the moment to produce a set of recommendations around the regional roadmap later this year. So a very strong regional focus for the work of JSA. One of the things that we are doing, and attracts a great deal of attention, and we're continuing to drill down on it, is we produced a thing called the Occupational Shortage List for Australia. And as the name suggests, it's providing us with the 300 or so occupations in Australia which are in shortage, and we annually produce that list. That list is used by government for a whole range of purposes: incentives for apprenticeships and other priority traineeships and activities or investment by government is linked to that. It's a direct link into the skilled migration settings for Australia. But in doing that, we do a lot of work on trying to understand why we have shortages in Australia. We do a skill shortage typology, which I won't put up and show you, but it's quite a sophisticated analysis of why we have shortages, which we're extending and developing. And then we do a particular diversity lens on that. So for example, one of the things that we particularly highlight is, if you look at the 300 occupations in shortage in Australia, If you're in a male-dominated occupation, you're 50% more likely to be in shortage. If you're in a female-dominated occupation, about 40% in shortage. And given that healthcare and social assistance is the biggest growing sector of the Australian economy and a very feminised part of the Australian economy, that means we do have a very gender-skewed labour market in Australia. But if you happen to have a gender-balanced occupation, you have a much lower level of shortage, which is a very positive characteristic when you talk about productivity. Less shortage, less drag, less inertia, more productivity. It's a very positive thing. So gender balance in an occupation is a very positive thing. So what does that mean? Well, I do a lot of work to showcase in Australia where are we seeing really interesting initiatives to bring women into male-dominated occupations and men into female-dominated occupations? How do we address challenges in the construction industry and in other spaces where we have very often toxic workplace? We also do a lot of analysis of volatility in occupations as well. These are often feminised occupations where we see a lot of movement in and out, a lot of attrition, retention difficulties. It happens a lot in aged care, disability care, early childhood education and care in Australia, so we produce a great deal of analysis of that, and again highlight and shine a light on what I see as really valuable initiatives to address those challenges. So we do a lot of work on diversity. Just to let you know, there are four reasons in Australia we have diversity. We have shortages, long and short form training gaps, which is literally we're not training enough people for the job opportunities that are out there. We have suitability gap problems, which is where we have industry wanting people with a particular skill set. We think we produce enough of them, but they don't get the jobs. Something's happening in the skill system not to properly equip them. They don't have the employability skills, they don't have the work experience, they don't have some aspect of the more cognitive and critical thinking skills that employers want. We do a lot of analysis of that, and we encourage industry and vet providers and universities to work better together to design the curriculum of the future. And we have what's called a retention gap problem, which is where the volatility is. And so we look there at how can we identify approaches to that and make recommendations to government to address it. We're doing more work on that. The final thing on this slide I wanted to highlight, again going back to integrated data assets, is the work we're doing to really understand what happens in Australia as people move through our vet system and our higher education system. And we do it by linking together our big national data assets. So this is through the Australian tax database. So we understand, people eventually have to pay tax whether we like it or not. So you're picked up through the ATO, not you, but we are. Similarly through our higher education data, our vet data, our social security data assets, our sort of business data assets. So we have a real sense of linking those together, as you do here in New Zealand, and we interrogate it to see, well, for example, we've just completed some work on the 2020-2021 financial year, and we looked at every Australian who completed a vet qualification in that period of time, about 500,000 Australians. And we looked at their characteristics before they did their vet qual and after. And we tracked them for a year to see what happened to them in the labour market and through the tax system. So what did we find? What does it mean to have completed a vet qualification during COVID, which is interesting. It's a bit of an artefact there. By the way, we've done this every year now for 3 consecutive years. So we're now trending the data on this. 500,000's a big number. So, give you the highlights. Median income uplift of about $16,000 compared to pre-post. Now that's significant but not hugely significant. What's more significant is about 24% of those who complete a vet qual go on to further qualifications. They go on to do more vet, higher level vet, more higher level into higher education. And we're now tracking some who don't go up, they continue at the same level of vet. We're just tracking those through as well. Employability goes up about 16 percentage points. So their employability before, they're doing some part-time work, they're in the labour market, post completing a vet qual, 16 percentage point increase. I think one of the most telling pieces of data is for those who are on income support from the Commonwealth, 40% fewer on income support if they complete a vet qual. So there's some powerful data in there about the importance of the vet system in Australia. We're doing the same with higher ed at the moment, but it's more complex. Higher education doesn't link directly into the labour market in the same way that vocational education and training does, but we'll see the outcome of that a little later this year. The other thing we're doing, which I think is a really important part of this in the political debate in Australia, is to understand what happens to the people who don't complete a vet qual. They start but don't complete. And this gets a lot of political attention in Australia. A lot of criticism of government for funding free TAFE in Australia, for example, because of the suggestion from some that so many of those people don't complete, which means it's a waste of public money. We're now tracking non-completers because, to be honest, it's not failure. Many of them get a great deal of value in Australia from completing some vet competencies, and we're tracking them into the labour market. Early indications are we're seeing a significantly different outcome for them compared to a group that didn't complete any vet qualification at all. So the use of big integrated data assets drives a lot of the work we do at JSA to understand the dynamics of the Australian labour market and give advice to the government. And to give you an indication of that, these are some of the reports that we've put out. All of these reports have the same characteristics. It's an area of national priority. There's an interest from government in what's happening to the workforce or the potential workforce, and what is the skill needs that that government needs to address in order to ensure that we have a workforce for the future. And what happens to the transitional aspects of the labour market, those parts of the Australian economy that will be impacted by a major national priority like clean energy, decarbonisation, net zero. What does that mean to those communities that might be working in coal-fired power stations in the Hunter Valley? What happens to those communities? So we look at the transitional aspects of those, particularly with a lens on disadvantaged groups and how they can be affected, and suggestions about how to address that. And then finally, we make recommendations about what changes are necessary in the national skills system to make sure we are fit for purpose. Often that's about training packages in vet that might need to be updated, revised, changed, new packages developed. It may be in higher education programs that need to be addressed. It might be postgraduate research if we need research capability. Clean energy was about 18 months ago. Food supply chain, the essential ingredient, food supply chain for Australia. This is a post-COVID sovereign risk issue for Australia. Do we have an agricultural workforce? What's happening to them? There's 1 million people in Australia that work in ag, either in production, manufacture or transport. So it's a huge part of the Australian economy. Almost all of those people live in regional Australia. Is the skills system adequate to support them? No, and we identify in the report ways in which our skills system needs to respond to that. We have problems with veterinary science in regional Australia and veterinary nurses in regional Australia, just as an example of that. Biosecurity challenges for Australia, similarly identified. We have a high reliance on working holiday maker visa holders in Australia for ag work, particularly horticulture and meat processing. And similarly for PALM, the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Program, very big part of our ag workforce. We make a lot of recommendations about ensuring that has integrity into the future. So that was a big study released earlier this year. Now, the bulk of the recommendations from that are currently being implemented by one of our Jobs and Skills Councils. We have 10 Jobs and Skills Councils that are verticals in the Australian economy, and the one responsible for ag is picking up all of those recommendations related to skills. The future of early childhood education and care, a very big study in the middle of last year, very timely in Australia. We have a lot of concern around early childhood in Australia at the moment, and a government committed to universal early childhood availability, but it's a very challenging workforce. We made a number of recommendations, a lot of it to do with training packages and higher education programs that needed reform, but equally we need to address some fundamentals about that workforce because of attrition challenges, and obviously it is under-remunerated. We have 3 studies we've just released, which I thought may be of interest to you. Our Gender Economic Equality Study is the first of its kind. It is another big integrated data asset piece. It's looking at gender pay gap in a very sophisticated way in Australia. That report just came out last week. It's getting a lot of attention in the Australian media. The next 2 reports come out over the next month, including recommendations to government about how to address some of these challenges. This is not a survey-based report. This is an integrated data asset-based report. So we interrogated at the PLIDA level, the person level, integrated data asset level, what happens to women as they navigate the labour market. Towards a regional, rural and remote jobs and skills roadmap. This is again what I mentioned earlier. We've done a big report on regional Australia, and the report that got a lot of attention last week and still gets some attention is our work on Gen AI. This is a very unique study worldwide, so it has taken the last 9 months of our team at JSA to pull this together. It is a very comprehensive analysis of our view of the impact of Gen AI on the Australian labour market. It is a whole of labour market analysis. Without necessarily wanting to get into a lot of the detail, I know, having spoken to your ministers yesterday, there's certainly a lot of interest in what AI is going to do in the New Zealand economy, which is appropriate and sensible to do. I think a lot of what's in this report would resonate as well here as it would in Australia. The big message that has got a lot of attention, contrary to a lot of studies, JSA's view is, and by the way, we analysed 1,000 occupations in Australia at the task level. So we broke those occupations down to task level, and we interrogated them at task level for the likely impact of AI. And we determined an augmentation or automation index for those occupations. Are they more likely to be augmented by AI, so the job is still there but AI is valuable for certain tasks? Or are they going to be automated? Likely the whole job is going to go and be automated. Or eventually is there going to be adaptation, new jobs from old? Interestingly, in our analysis, a lot more augmentation than automation. There will be automation, no doubt about it, but there's a lot of augmentation. And that led us to a whole series of recommendations in the report about skills and the need to upskill Australia to be able to have agency in the disruptive effect of generative AI on the Australian labour market and agentic AI in the context of how it will change our labour market into the future. So we're recommending a whole range of things to do with AI literacy, AI competency and AI fluency amongst both vet completers and higher ed graduates, make sure they're future-proof from a career perspective. Obviously, pedagogy and curriculum reform that's going to be needed right across the tertiary system, upskilling those working in the tertiary system so that they can participate in this. And talking to Martin last night, certainly some really interesting things happening here in New Zealand in that way, so I was really impressed by that. And then a lot more short course. We've got to do a lot of upskilling in Australia. We need micro-credentials, accredited short courses, a lot more of that. There'll be a lot more discussion about how that's implemented. Broadly speaking, those skill-based recommendations have been broadly accepted by business and unions. I think government are very keen to have a compact around skills. The two things in Australia that are attracting attention, the Digital Skills Compact in New South Wales and the AI Accelerator. They're both new initiatives to grow on-scale digital skills in Australia. So Gen AI, I would encourage you, if you're interested in it, to have a look, and the report is out. A lot of the technical work and the methodological work is on our website, and there's also an interactive portal where you can go and check which job is going to be impacted by AI and by how much, if you want to test it at the moment. It's a point-in-time analysis. The world is changing. Interesting today to see what's happening to NASDAQ in the United States with the tech stocks dropping, largely around an MIT report that said productivity gains from AI weren't as significant as people had anticipated. So that's an interesting phenomenon. That will happen with a volatile tech-infused revolution, but there's one thing that's certain. There is a huge amount of AI, Gen AI, being used already by workers, and we uncovered that in our report. A lot of hidden use of Gen AI. Two other things we're doing at the moment that don't have a glossy cover: the National Skills Taxonomy work. Part of our view of the system, the tertiary system, is we do need to appreciate the world is moving much more towards skills than qualifications and credentials. We have to understand skills better, and we need a language for skills. And the gendered sort of language that exists in current skill classifications, for example, is not adequate or fit for purpose. So we're developing a new national skills taxonomy for Australia, working with Singapore, Europe, the United States, doing similar things. That will be a next version, or the next discussion paper will be out shortly on the NST. It will fit in, I think, in Australia to the development of a national skills passport concept as well, particularly for equity groups and students coming through school and higher ed, so they have more assistance to demonstrate their skills for potential job opportunities. So the NST, very, very important. And the work we've done on VET outcomes we're doing for higher ed, so there'll be a big report on that a little later this year. I've gone through this as just a bit more detail on Gen AI to give you a sense of whole of labour market. Again, transition was very important here. We looked at not just the exposure analysis that I just mentioned, we did some economic modelling as well to see whether we'd see a drop away in jobs in Australia by virtue of different scenarios about adoption of Gen AI. The answer is yes, you see a little bit, but actually it recovers pretty quickly. There's a lot of jobs growth into the future. And we looked at some vulnerable groups, women in particular here, who are in vulnerable clerical and administrative jobs, which are very subject to augmentation from AI. And they tend, when we track them from that sort of occupation, they move into other vulnerable occupations. So there is a labour mobility challenge for Australia to try and ensure we can address some of those unfortunate, yes, we're going to have less automation than perhaps people might have imagined, but if those people affected are actually going to move into other vulnerable areas, we've got a problem to deal with, so we've identified that, and of course all of the skill system implications. A lot of universities in Australia, for example, saying, yes, we're doing all of this with AI. Every graduate, yesterday, I was at an AFR conference the day before yesterday in Sydney, and the Minister was saying that a Vice-Chancellor had said to him, within 5 years all of our graduates will be AI literate. And I went on straight after and said, that's too late. If you're waiting 5 years to make sure your students have a competency with AI, then they're going to miss out in the labour market. So get on with it. So the strong message there to universities to get on with it. Best practice and so on we've had a look at. I won't go through that. I think I've covered off all of this. More augmentation. It's early. It'll vary across occupations. We need the right sort of skills. It's got to be an entire skills system response. We also recommend the government plays a role in Australia to literally steward and lead and develop a national strategy. I know you have one here in New Zealand. I think there's a national AI strategy. I'm not sure it goes to the same level of detail as what we're suggesting, but definitely in the skills space we need to have some stewardship from government. I think I've mentioned a little bit about our gender economic equality study. Occupational and skill system segregation. Very interesting data coming out of this when you take into account over a decadal view gender pay gap and you take into account superannuation impacts on women, you have a much larger gender pay gap. So those sorts of insights are being quantified for the first time. And of course we've developed a gender framework which will help us in all of our work so that we ensure we take a particular gender lens to all the work that we do. I won't go through this, I'll leave it for you to look at. I want to talk a little bit about what's happening in the tertiary system in Australia to give you a sense of the changes that are underway, and some of them very, very recent, announcements made in Australia in the last few days by the government. We recommended earlier this year, and one of the reports I didn't show you was a report on tertiary harmonisation. Peter Dawkins, who was the JSA Commissioner and a former Vice-Chancellor in Australia, led one of our big studies last year into how can we have a better, more joined up, more coherent tertiary education system rather than having a vet sector and a higher education sector that butt up to each other. How do we make this system work more effectively, and what is the benefit of having a more joined up system? Now, this is challenging in the federated model of Australian democracy because states and territories control the vet system to a large extent, even though there's a lot of Commonwealth funding that supports it. And of course, higher education funding comes through the Commonwealth directly to universities, even though states have legislation universities have legislation at the state level. So it's quite a complicated system to try and encourage some form of greater cohesion and greater joined-uppedness. There's a bit of an aversion to saying integration here, by the way. We avoid that word. It's never to be used in the same sentence as tertiary system. I was on the Accord panel with Mary O'Kane and others. We recommended a more integrated tertiary education system, and it's really that recommendation that's now getting attention, but the states and territories do not like integration. They, and quite rightly, see the value of the VET system independent of the higher education system, but they're beginning to see there is value in better connection and cohesion between them. It's a complex system. The architecture in Australia is quite complicated as well. So we have our qualifications framework, which needs review and will be reviewed. We need a national skills taxonomy. I mentioned that. We desperately need a national credit transfer system. So the biggest challenge, whenever I spoke to state and territory ministers and said, are you interested in tertiary harmonisation? They said, if you solve credit transfer, I'm interested. Because their problem is that if you want to go from a diploma of nursing at VET level to a Bachelor of Nursing and Midwifery, there are 39 universities and probably 78 different ways of doing it. And that's a drag. That puts a barrier in front, particularly of disadvantaged students finding a way to navigate through the system. It's far too complicated to understand credit transfer arrangements in a system that operates like that. So there's a lot of impetus now for a national credit transfer system in Australia. We have a lot of regulatory challenges. We have two big regulators, TEXA and ASQA, that regulate higher ed and VET, and then there are others at state level. And of course, funding is the biggest issue. They're funded differently. And in Australia, that problem will be longer and harder to address. Benefits, we certainly see benefits from it at the student level as well as the industry level. Certainly efficiency and effectiveness would be enhanced if we got rid of barriers and made credit transfer alone, or RPL, much easier in Australia. RPL is getting a lot of attention at the moment in the Economic Reform Roundtable that Treasurer Chalmers is running, because they realise that we have 620,000 visa holders, migrants in Australia, who are not being properly utilised in the labour market because their skills aren't recognised. So recognition of prior learning, huge issue in Australia. We can get more efficient, we can be more effective, we can remove barriers. There's a gender and equity lens here in particular, particularly around equity. Our VET system is much better at uplifting people from a disadvantaged background into tertiary education than universities are, even with enabling and foundation programs. And so we need to tap into that success, that safe environment for TAFE and VET in Australia, and say we can build on that to create more ease of access into higher education if necessary, or into the labour market for people from a disadvantaged background. So there's a definite equity lens to it. Supporting national challenges, this is about aligning skills with demand. So we believe this will help us to improve the curriculum so that the skills people have as they emerge from the VET system or higher ed are better aligned with the needs of industry and business. So there's a real alignment issue there, and of course that leads to productivity benefits. So we think it has a very significant economic benefit to do this, alongside the student benefit and of course the industry benefit to it. I'm conscious of time and I want to leave time for questions. It's a complicated space. So the thing that was announced yesterday, the day before, by Minister Clare was to establish a tertiary system advisory council involving states, territories and key stakeholders. I'm chairing that advisory council. The role that it has is really to set the roadmap over the next 6 months so that we can know precisely how we move forward to deliver exactly the outcomes we need to have a more harmonious system and to bring people with us in that journey. So a lot of players, interesting conversation around the sort of delineation of VET and higher ed, because we all know this is grey at the fringes, and in Australia it's very grey in various ways. So we need to understand that better, the knowledge and skills dimensions of both VET and higher ed. Qualifications design, credit transfer, cultural issues. I mean, a lot of the challenges that we face in tertiary harmonisation in Australia are cultural issues inside universities, to try and shift universities to be more willing to acknowledge the skills that people have. That's why skills taxonomy, we believe, is really important, to bring them into the higher education sector. Funding for collaboration incentives and financial support for students to participate, coherent data collection. One thing that comes out of all of this is we need good data, big data assets. I won't go through all of this. Our report had 3 sets of recommendations in it. Some early wins that we thought we could do. So, let's get the governance right. Let's get the state and territory involvement right. Let's make sure that the Australian Tertiary Education Commission has a role, the new ATEC has a role in this, and let's make sure we monitor progress. In doing it, credit transfer, innovation, qualification guidelines, the new ATEC, CSPs for TAFEs, of course, means in a big way putting Commonwealth-supported places, subsidies into TAFE to do higher ed programs. Now, that happens to a small extent in Australia. The intent is to broaden that opportunity for TAFE, and particularly vocational degrees, degree apprenticeships, that sort of model. And we need to cooperate more on enabling between the 2 sectors, and then medium-term horizon issues there. AQF is hard. We can finalise the NST, and funding, of course, in that regard. So we have a number of recommendations there worth having a look at. So government's now accepted the report, has indicated, the Prime Minister's indicated this is now a matter of policy mandate in Australia to move forward on it. They're important steps, and the next stage will be how do we actually make this happen, working with states and territories. I've talked about the skills taxonomy. I won't say much more, but if you're interested in that work, I'd really encourage you to have a look at the JSA website, to have a look at it, including you would think this is easy, what's the definition of a skill? I don't know how many people are in this room, but I tell you what, we'd have more than one definition of a skill. And I know if we had unions in the room and business, we'd have another 2 definitions. And we need to be very careful about that. So we've gone to a lot of trouble to try and work that through, using a lot of international support along the way. So that's taken us a few months, but I think we're in a good place now with the next phase of work on the skills taxonomy, and that has some funding from the government to move it forward. I want to talk about ATEC because I'm one of the interim commissioners for ATEC, along with Mary O'Kane and Larissa Barrent, Mary chaired the Accord review in Australia, the universities, 2 years ago. I was on that, and so Larissa was there as well, and Larissa is now a Deputy Commissioner to Mary as the Interim Chief Commissioner and myself as JSA Commissioner. So we have a number of priorities to set the ATEC up for next year. So I'm meeting I don't think you call it a TEC. Martin said don't call it a TEC. It's a TEC, or it's a Tertiary Education Commission, or something else, whatever you call it. I'm meeting Tim Fowler to discuss what you do in New Zealand and see if we can learn from that later today. But we are moving our system in a really quite significant way. So from 2027, we move from a demand-driven system with marginally funded load, which has characterised Australian higher ed for nearly a decade, which meant progressively the average dollars per student have been decreasing, to a managed growth environment. So there'll be growth, but it will be capped, and the growth places will be allocated by the ATEC. There will be needs-based funding, much more significantly than now, for equity groups, and that will be demand-driven, but only at the system level, not at the institution level. So there is capacity to grow, but only if the system maxes out on equity places through negotiated compacts with universities. So it's a very different system. The other component of what the ATEC will do, of course, is to allocate growth places for international students. So it'll provide universities with their international student profile and their domestic student profile, as well as negotiating a system approach rather than 39 competitive universities in Australia. So it's going to be challenging. We have a number of things that we are doing at the moment. The legislation goes before Parliament later this year, and I think it will be subject to a review in the Senate, because I'm sure the Greens will have a view about this and the role of ATEC, and they are important in the Senate in Australia. And it's also the beginning of the next phase of reform, because the Albanese government's mandate is so significant now, coming into its second term. There is an appetite for longer term reform in Australia, and if those of you that looked at the University Accord review will know that we made about 50 recommendations. More than half of those have been picked up and implemented, including a student ombud in Australia, review of governance, review of strategic investment in research and development in Australia. A whole raft of things have been implemented, including managed growth and needs-based funding. We haven't yet reviewed our Jobs Ready Graduates reforms in Australia, which distorted the income contingent loans very much to make them much higher in the humanities and business and law than they are in other disciplines. That problem has created a lot of tension in Australia. But there are still a range of recommendations yet to be addressed out of the Accord. So we're looking at those again now to see what we can recommend to government for the next phase of reform. Now, I don't think I have time, but I was going to encourage you to have a look at two OECD studies. You may already have seen them. One is the PISA study that came out just a few months ago, which looked at career aspirations of 15-year-olds across 750,000 young people. And the reason I wanted to put it up is a big issue in Australia is the aspiration of young people for tertiary education. In regional Australia at the moment, 1 in 6 15 to 24-year-olds is not in work or study. 1 in 10 in metropolitan Australia are not in work or study. And I think you have a similar challenge here in New Zealand. We also have a decreasing completion rate to year 12, and we have a ludicrously high number of young people who think their career path is being a social media influencer. We have a really challenging set of issues in Australia that we need to get our head around, because all of the wonderful opportunities of the future will be extraordinarily out of reach if we leave a generation behind because we haven't engaged with them. Better careers advice, better vocational education and training in schools so that they have a choice, they have some pre-employment and pre-apprenticeship opportunities if that's a choice they want to pursue. One of the staggering things about this list, PISA have done this for a long time, right? The 10 top jobs that young people think they're going to do at age 15 hasn't changed in 30 years. What is worse, the long list has got shorter. And the other thing that is crazy is it doesn't align with the job growth of the future. So we really are not helping young people to make decisions about their future. There is quite a difference here in terms of career advice in schools, which I won't go through in detail. This is Australia. Disadvantaged students who say they've had some careers advice, and advantaged students, this is SES-based, advantage and disadvantage. So Australia's above the OECD average, which is good, but still only 57%. I thought that I would put in, this one is occupational ambition. Are they going to go on to university? That's that sort of thing. This one is educational ambition. This one is, this one's New Zealand. I want to put it up because this one worried me because New Zealand was much lower than the OECD average. I think it's almost the bottom of the OECD on this one. And this is aspiration to go on to tertiary education. And Australia's 56% for disadvantaged students, 85% for advantaged. Here in New Zealand, on the OECD data, it was 35 and 70. And I thought, well, that's a challenge for both our countries, particularly for disadvantaged students. One of the big fundamental drivers of Australia's tertiary reform is that we need to, what we have failed at over the last 20 years is having the level of participation by equity groups in tertiary education that we need for the economy of the future. And we need to do much more to uplift equity students for participation in 92% of all jobs within 5 years will need tertiary education in Australia, 92%. So we cannot leave them behind. So we've got to do something to address that. So career aspirations of 15-year-olds is a good indicator of a challenge ahead of us. The other paper, which I won't go through, is the OECD Skills First paper, which is much better for New Zealand than it is for Australia. That's why I put it in. I thought, nice balance. The last one, not good for you. Next one, good for you. It's a worth reading because it is... and Skills England is the partner organisation to JSA, and it's putting out some great reports about what's happening in the UK. But just on Skills First, this is a really interesting characteristic of the labour market worldwide, and that is increasingly industry, business is recruiting on skills, not on jobs, not on qualifications. It's a big trend. Whole lot of this OECD report looked at a lot of LinkedIn data and they rated countries by their preparedness for a skills-first future. We're working with Singapore at the moment with JSA about their big work on skills first. You're going to see more and more and more and more of this, which is why micro-credentials and short courses are really important, as well as the fundamental question of why do we have universities and what is lifelong learning and what does education really mean. We haven't got time to drill into that, which is vitally important. But skills first is a really important characteristic. There are some positive things happening in New Zealand, but I've left them on the floor. Thank you very much.
Professor Glover, thank you very, very much for such an insightful presentation. Lots that we can learn from, and we've got a whole host of questions. And you know what? You've done amazingly on time. We've got about 15 minutes for questions. Yeah. So we've got top question of the day. New Zealand doesn't have an organisation like the JSA to support nationwide intelligence around jobs and skills. We're small, fragmented. What can we learn from JSA around centralised advice? What advice will you give to Tim Fowler this afternoon and the NZQA?
Yeah, okay. Well, I wouldn't presume to give advice to either Tim or Grant, but I'm looking forward to hearing from them about New Zealand experience, particularly Tim. You've got a Tertiary Education Commission. I think it'll be different to the Australian version, but that doesn't mean we can't learn from each other. I think NZQA naturally works within a pretty rigid structure. That's the nature of qualification agencies around the world. TEXA is just going through in Australia quite a bit of change to respond to criticism over the last few years of its performance as a regulator. I think that'll be interesting to watch. So I'm interested in having those conversations about emerging trends in Australia. The issue about centralised capacity is a really interesting one. And it's interesting that the precursor organisation to JSA was created by a Liberal National Party government. It wasn't a Labor government. It was a Liberal National Party government that wanted evidence-based advice on policy. And in order to do that, it knew it had to interrogate big data assets to find out what sort of policy interventions work. I didn't mention one of the things you can do with big data assets that we're now beginning to do. We've just run a trial, which is retrospective randomised control trials. If you want to know whether a policy intervention actually has the difference you expected it to have, you've got to go back and do a randomised control trial. So if you, for example, the question, all of that descriptive data about the outcomes of VET, is it really the VET qual that is creating the big uplift in the lives of those people? We went back and we took 100,000 people who did the VET qual, 100,000 who didn't, and we matched them across a dozen characteristics to do a big regression on it. Not surprisingly, yes, the VET qual is statistically significant in generating uplift in all of those indicators. Bear in mind there's another characteristic, that's motivation and willingness to do the VET qual that's so important. So it comes back to my earlier point, we've got to uplift aspiration. We talk in Australia about parity of esteem a lot between VET and higher ed, so that parents and those others who influence young people in their decision making realise that this is a great pathway and it can have life-changing opportunity. And if we don't start having politicians talk that way, we're not going to change the minds of parents and other people influencing young people. So that's a big drive. You're going to see some initiatives coming out in Australia around that. So yes, I think centralised capability is huge. I don't think, from what I've heard, your integrated data initiative is working as well as it could in New Zealand. So that's something that I mentioned yesterday to the ministers. I think there's a great deal we get value out of that. We are much bigger. JSA has 200 people working for it, so it's a big agency. It's small, but it's comparatively big. And there are pockets of that in New Zealand. So there is a way to bring it together. Ireland has just done this, right? Ireland, New Zealand, pretty similar. I mean, it's about 7 million people and half a dozen unis. Their National Skills Council is pulling together this capability in Ireland. So there's a good indicator there that it's not Singapore is doing it as well. So you don't have to be a big country to get value from more coordination. So it'd be something that I think, and I think you have a government, as any relatively new government is, it's looking for policy ideas. And clearly in this sector you're under some challenge. The research base of giving advice to government's under threat. I think you need to provide them with the positive suggestions about bringing about change. And I think JSA is a model that could be could be looked at.
That's a really, really good segue into the next question, and we have a lot of people in this room that's being affected by reforms and by policy change and the flip-flop that we are seeing when our governments are changing. So the question is, would a change in government in Australia risk the JSA closing?
Look, it's a good question. We've just gone through an election, so as I went into it, I did a lot of work with the opposition. I'm an independent statutory officer. I don't see myself politicised. I engage with both sides of politics to brief them. Certainly my minister gets very detailed briefings, but beyond that I provide briefings to the opposition about the work that we're doing. I think the opposition appreciates those briefings. I think they understand the value of JSA. They created the NSC. The challenging bit, to be frank, would be tripartite, because that's very much a characteristic of a Labor government, to make sure the unions are included alongside business and government. I think it makes a huge difference to the quality of our work. And there's ways to do that even with a change of government. But I'm independent statutory officer. I cannot be sacked. So, that would be a bit tough on them. I'd be a nuisance for a while, I can tell you. But I think there may be changes to the legislation, but they'd have to get the changes through the Senate. And the Senate in Australia is a very interesting beast.
Loving that. Imagine a job where you can't get sacked.
I mean, there's a real strategy in Australia politically, as people probably understand. It's a bit like free TAFE at the moment, right? This was a big political issue before the election. The government pushed really rapidly through legislation to enshrine free TAFE. Now, you might think, well, a new government just unwind it. No, they can't, because they would not have control of the Senate. So legislation is really meaningful in a country where our upper house, in a bicameral system, you don't have majority of one side of politics. And so in this case we have 12 Greens, and they have a very strong view about free TAFE. So I doubt a government could change it. So legislation is an important protective measure, I think, to something like JSA.
Great. Then we had quite a few conversations yesterday about degree level apprenticeships. How are they being thought about in our Western Island cousins?
Yes, and one of the reasons I wanted to come over and talk to Catherine, we met up at a presentation I gave in Australia, and we were talking about the early work in Australia on degree apprenticeships, and I know New Zealand's done some work on that, so I was really interested in what New Zealand were doing and what the UK was doing, so it was great to hear what Concove were doing, and I really appreciated Catherine's advice on that, and that led to this invitation to be here. So, look, it's an active conversation. The word apprenticeship is a bit of a protected zone in Australia from an industrial perspective, so you've got to be careful about it sometimes just triggering a negative response, whereas what we're really talking about is interesting vet higher ed pathways with a strong industry involvement, rich with work integrated learning, internships, summer programs and job opportunities at the end, and we're seeing the first elements of that. One of the problems we have is a technical problem in Australia. Some of the companies that want to pay the HECS, the income contingent loan component for students, to bring them into the program with no debt, they incur a fringe benefits tax challenge. It doubles the cost to them, which is a real problem because we can't get scale. So we need to fix some of those peculiarities. But we're very interested in it. We think it's a great example of tertiary harmonisation. Want to see more of it in Australia. And I think the vehicle to deliver it, a new initiative in Australia, our TAFE Centres of Excellence. Now, this is a very strategically important move by the government to put a lot of money into these TAFE Centres of Excellence, where our TAFEs are at the centre. They have to involve universities and business. They're in areas of national priority. They'll have access to Commonwealth supported places. They'll develop vocational degrees. They're going to be quite powerful, but universities are not being funded. It's being funded through TAFE, and that's creating a different dynamic between universities and TAFE, back to that parity of esteem conversation. So I think that will help us with degree apprenticeships.
Oh. Great. Then we have a question around formal and non-formal learning. Does JSA have a position on formal versus non-formal learning in the workplace in the future of Australia?
We don't have positions on things. We produce reports with lots of recommendations, so you can draw a conclusion on our position on something. And we're about to embark in our next work plan on that fourth pillar work that I mentioned, which is really around what's happening in the non-accredited space in business. There's a suggestion in Australia that the level of business investment in training has dropped quite a bit over the last 20 years. You hear figures from 4% to 15% drop. We don't have good baseline data, and you can imagine why we're attracted to it. We love baselining data, so we're going to have a very good look at that. We'll make some recommendations on it later in the year. That'll give us better insight. So if you're interested, we'll probably release an insight paper on it a bit later this year to give our first touch of what we're seeing, where the data gaps might be, and what our surveys of industry partners are saying.
Great. So I think we've got time for another two. Please give us your perspective on how you see the four skills provision areas: vocational, tertiary, migration and business training change, merge, overlap and collaborate in the future.
It's a good question. The view I tried to give you about a more harmonised tertiary system is really a VET higher ed and really a TAFE university focused vision initially, and to get those two sectors working better together, which means we should see a much more collaborative. If you think about a system, the characteristics of a system that we're most interested in watching are innovation, collaboration and sustainability, right? And I put in sustainability because we have some Australian universities that are struggling a lot at the moment because of some of the vagaries of our demand-driven system, which is about to change. So we have to stabilise them and provide them with a sustainability path. So the system characteristics we're interested in will need incentivising to a certain extent. So I think you'll see much more of that and much richer collaboration between universities, and I think there's already discussions going on. Those TAFE Centres of Excellence will be an example of that. Business, there's a big thematic emerging through this economic roundtable about business leaning in more to some of the things they're critical of. So they're critical of, we can't hire a graduate with the right skill set. Well, hello, why don't you help us know what the right skill set is? Lean into this particular problem, be involved more, provide more work integrated learning, start working more closely with VET and higher ed, and we may not have that problem. The Tech Council in Australia made this wild suggestion a few months ago that 99% of computer science graduates were unemployable. Well, I can tell you deans of computer science went bonkers in Australia over that. But what a useless piece of data. It's the tech industry's fault, not the university's fault. Lean into the problem, become more involved in it. So I think we're going to see a greater level of that. Otherwise, I think business will be held to account, which might lead to, who knows, levies, other things might happen, things they don't want to see happen, if they're in fact not actively leaning in. I think they'll commit to much more work integrated learning and to a richer involvement around the skill matching, and I think that's a good first step. I think when we uncover the lid on what's happening inside business with training, that will put a bit of a shock into the system, probably lead, I think, to a little bit more work with universities to accredit things so they're a bit more visible. I think that would happen. I think the big sleeper here is what happens with micro-credentials. Australia doesn't have a business model for micro-credentials yet. In 2022, in that Skills First report, if you look at it, one of the bits of data that struck me was the United States awarded in US institutions 1 million micro-credentials. So Australia is really behind the eight ball in trying to get its head around how do we make that work. There's an Institute for Applied Technology Digital in Sydney, collaboration between UTS, Macquarie and TAFE New South Wales and Microsoft and Salesforce and a few others. And it's been delivering micro skills, and I think it's just delivered over 3 years the 300,000th micro skill. But at the moment, that's all funded by the New South Wales government. That's not a sustainable business model. So we've got to figure out a different way of doing that.
Cool. And echoing some of what we saw yesterday, which is get involved if we want the systems to change.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Get involved, yeah.
So, are you doing any research on trans-Tasman skill exchange and what skills Aussie are gaining from New Zealand and vice versa?
It's an interesting question. We're not particularly focused on that issue. Our skilled migration work, perhaps I'll make a couple of comments. One, we are likely to do some work in the next 12 months on Australia's research and PhD workforce. So we don't have any data. This came up yesterday with your ministers asking me about research quality assessment in Australia, which we don't do at the moment. It's in abeyance. But because it's been in abeyance, we don't have line of sight anymore on data about what's happening to researchers in Australian universities. And at the moment, with the downsizing going on in some universities, there's a real challenge around that. So we're going to be looking at that again through the big integrated data assets to see, well, where are those people going? And I think we'll find them, going internationally as much as domestically, and possibly moving out of research, which I think is the brain drain thing we're concerned about. I have another hat. I have so many hats, but one hat I'm really proud of is I'm on the University Grants Committee for the University of the South Pacific, and which means I've worked very closely with DFAT and MFAT here in New Zealand, and of course I get first-hand a sense of what's happening in the South Pacific, New Zealand and Australia playing our role in things like PALM and nurses and teachers coming out of the South Pacific to teach in Australia and New Zealand. I think we've got a mobility challenge. I understand the reasons it's happening the way it does, but it has some pretty serious impacts on our South Pacific neighbours. So I think there are a whole range of things about mobility we need to understand better. But we're not targeting New Zealand, trust me. I made the mistake yesterday. I think it's 8% of New Zealand nurses are in Australia, and I quoted that piece of data. That didn't go down well, I can tell you. One last question. Funding reform. As we know, funding dictates behaviour. Currently our funding is broken in the basis of so much.
We touch a little bit on the funding. That would be great to get you.
I think managed growth. I made a comment on it to your ministers yesterday. We've thought a lot about how to stop the really toxic behaviours in our system and driving us to a highly bifurcated system. The University of Sydney has made a accumulated surplus of nearly $2 billion in 3 years, and at the other end of the spectrum you've got universities that are broke. So we have a system that's broken as well as you, and we have to stabilise it. The Minister's very committed to it. Our regional universities are under huge pressure. So we believe a more controlled environment through managed growth and a Tertiary Education Commission allocating that growth will begin to moderate the behaviours, and that will lead to stability and growth. So the challenge is not that system, it's getting to that system, because they're all over the place at the moment. You've got to settle them down. That's a challenge. Thank you.
That is great. Professor, that was fantastic to listen to you today. Thank you so much. That's where we're going to have to leave it. I think if you see by the number of questions, we could chat for the next day, actually. It was really fantastic. Insights to actions. You've left us with so much that we can consider in terms of how we go forward. Thank you for travelling across the ditch. And appreciate you being here. Great. Thank you.